Okay. Welcome everyone to the second talk on the practice of the mean. We have already looked at the opening passage last time, and it's very interesting, of course, because it is the third text out of the 4 books that we've introduced, and we can start to make comparisons with the highest learning and even the Analects. So when we think back to the highest learning, remember that at the very micro level, we talked about our thoughts arising and how we have to detect and ultimately evaluate them. Now, the practice of the mean takes us one step back, looking at the very fundamental aspect of nature. And if you remember, the opening lines to the practice of the mean introduced us to the notion of ultimate reality, the heaven, which imparts to us this nature or innate nature. If we follow this innate nature, we will realize the way, which is a way in which all things, people, events are flourishing and are in ultimate harmony with one another. And education, our learning and teaching, is none other than cultivating and realizing this way, realizing the ultimate reality in our everyday experiences. So you can see why the practice of the mean has been called the most philosophical text out of the 4 books. Today, we'll look at the next section in the text, and it's really a series of quotes by Confucius. And these quotes achieve 2 functions. The first is that it provides us with evidence for the claims that were made in the opening passage. But the other thing is that Confucius, through these passages, alerts us to some of the pitfalls that might occur as we embark on this journey. Unlike the Analects, these series of quotes are actually all related to the same theme, the practice of the mean, or the practice of the way. The Analects, as we remember, were sometimes quite separate and individual passages, whereas here it's quite logical. So let's take a look at the very first quote. Zhongni, if you remember, is the formal name of Confucius. So it says, Zhongni said, "The exemplary person practices the mean. The petty person acts contrary to the mean. The exemplary person's practice of the mean is being able to constantly maintain the mean. The petty person acts contrary to the mean, being without scruples." So here we're also very familiar with Confucius's teaching tool, using the 2 personas of the exemplary person and the petty person. So if we want to be exemplary, if we want to achieve excellence, we follow the ways of the exemplary person and look out not to do what the petty person does. So what does the exemplary person do? They practice the mean, whereas the petty person doesn't. How do they practice the mean? It says here that they're able to constantly maintain the mean. And this constancy is really the key word here, isn't it? This constancy is not just a physical presence, like if we were to say, oh, this person is constantly here. But it's rather refers to a mindset that remains unchanged and unmoved, regardless of the time or the place that we're in, regardless of who we are interacting with and what situation we find ourselves in. So this is this idea of an unchanged mindset. And this relates very nicely back with the earlier passage. If you remember, we read earlier in the text that the way could not be departed from for even a moment. This way is also constantly there. So the exemplary person, in their cultivation, they are constantly focused on this way, and that is the practice of the mean. So the mean is another word for our innate nature, or you could say the way. So if they are constantly maintaining practice of the mean, it means that they're constantly cultivating the way. They're constantly focused on this way that is actually meant to be always there in everything and in every moment. So last time we also spoke about how the way is not in a particular person, a place or event, but rather in our thought, in our attitude at that particular moment. So if we have this attitude of oneness, a care and consideration for the other person, then in that particular moment, it is the way. And this oneness makes me think of the fifth chapter in the Deeds of Wei, which talks about loving all beings. This idea of being able to have a very unconditional, universal love for all. But oftentimes when we read such phrases, or when we even talk about this idea of oneness, we might feel that it's quite unachievable. How are we meant to love a stranger like we love our parents? And that's not actually the point. If we think about it, we are meant to have this constant concern and care for everyone, but that is actually expressed differently. Now, think about the example of the human body. So, for example, the human body, every part of our body is important, has a function, and we need to look after every part. But we can't care for our face in the same way that we care for our feet. It has to be different. So how we look after something is related to what it needs at that particular time, place, and in relation to that specific context, that specific person or thing. And that is what we call this, that's what's needed in this constancy. In order to achieve this, we need specific guidelines, so we know that we're not doing too much or too little in this care and concern. And Jun Xuan tells us in his commentary to the practice of the mean that this is achieved through ritual propriety. So this idea of ritual propriety or ritual etiquette, pronounced as li in Chinese, is really, you could say, an accumulated tradition, a code of conduct, a way of thinking that helps us express our innate humanity, our innate nature, and helps us express our care and concern for others. So it's actually very useful. It's actually part of our innate nature. And so it's ritual propriety that provides us with specific guidelines as to how we go about living our lives. You could say that ritual propriety is the measure by which we know whether we're doing too much, we're spoiling someone, so this is this idea of going beyond, or not doing enough, we're neglecting them. So that's why ritual propriety is so important. Now, as part of really teasing out all the different aspects of this constancy, I thought it'd be useful to explore this concept of ritual propriety further by looking at the opening passage to the Records of Ritual, the Li Ji, one of the Confucian classics. And you can see that from the very first passage, that this idea of ritual propriety links very nicely with what we're trying to discuss in terms of constantly practicing the way. So let's take a look at that now. It says in the first line, always and in everything, let there be respectfulness. So again, there's this constancy in terms of respect. Now, there's various types of respect. So one type of respect is when we really admire someone for their scholarship, their skills, their character. And this respect comes from our admiration. Here, this is a different form of respect. This is the respect that is a due regard for the wishes, needs, and feelings of the other person. And it's not necessarily just living creatures. It could be for the environment and the surroundings that we're in. So that's why we can say we respect the environment. So this respect doesn't necessarily need admiration. This respect can be present in whatever we're doing, wherever we are, towards whatever we interact with. So that's why it says always and in everything, let there be respectfulness. It's a mindset that we have. And you could say this is very much consistent with the idea of maintaining this practice of the mean. So then how do we maintain this respectfulness? Obviously, we interact with the environment through our words and our actions. So that's what it talks about next. It says, with the deportment, grave is when one is thinking, and with speech, composed and definite. So this deportment relates to our conduct, our manner, our countenance, our body language, essentially. And it's grave, which means it's serious. Now, the seriousness doesn't mean that we can't smile, but it means that we're considered in what we do, and this shows in our conduct. So that's why it says, as if one is thinking. So everything that we do has a certain understanding and consideration of what might be the consequences for the people around us. And therefore, necessarily, our deportment is grave or has a sense of seriousness. Similarly, our speech is composed. It's clear, concise, logical, and sincere. So most importantly, it benefits others. So it's not about wasting someone's time or taking advantage of them. So this is this idea of speech that's composed and definite. It arises from our innate inner respectfulness. So these are the words and actions that come from that mindset of respectfulness. And what happens? Well, if we were the leader of a state, this would help bring peace to the people. Or what we say and do can change the fate of the nation. But what about as individuals? Well, as individuals, we also have a very direct and immediate impact on those around us. So we too can bring peace of mind to those around us through our words, our actions, and our mind frame. So that's what this particular passage says, that this constancy of mindset is seen throughout every word and our every action. However, most of us may find it very difficult to think about every word and action because oftentimes it's dictated by our emotions and how we feel towards things. And all of a sudden that changes what we say and do. So that's actually the next part in the Reports of Ritual. It provides us with 4 sort of common tendencies that we find ourselves in that might disrupt the equilibrium of our respectfulness and our wanting to be kind to the people around us. So these are pride, desires, aspirations, and pleasure. So let's look at the first one. Pride should not be allowed to grow. Now, there's a very common saying in English, proud as a peacock. So you can see a peacock with its feathers completely displayed, struts about in a way that's very, very proud of itself. And this is what happens when we become arrogant as well. So we could be proud of, what we've done, what we've said, our previous achievements, or even, how we look. We're proud of what we're wearing, and we might think we know more than others in the room. So therefore, we become arrogant. When we have this thought of arrogance, that I know more than others, I'm better than others, what happens to our body language? We're not so considerate with our body language. It comes across in our tone of voice, our facial expression, what we say, what we do. And what happens is that we might come across as offending others or being insensitive. So when that idea of pride or arrogance comes into our mind, it sort of stops us from thinking and being considerate and respectful of others. So that's why it's the first one that's listed here as something that we need to keep check on. Of course, it says that it shouldn't be allowed to grow. It doesn't say that we should completely uproot it, eradicate it, because in some ways the Records of Ritual is something that we should be able to relate to. There's no one who's not, somewhat proud of themselves, but we shouldn't let it grow. We should keep check on it. And that's what it's saying. Second, our desires. So this is the things that we like. And it's related to this idea of greed. Greed is insatiable. It's this bottomless pit. And once we start, it's a really slippery slope as well. So for our desires, we need to know not to continue down that path. So for example, you're going shopping and, you see some snacks and it's, complete impulse buying where you just see, you think that, you know that you like this snack and then you just buy it without thinking. Now, imagine if you're shopping for the family. You have to consider the family budget rather than simply what you want. Or you have to consider your household budget and think about how this relates to the bigger picture. If we indulge in our desires, we simply take what we want and we lose that consideration for the bigger picture and for others who may need other things and they may need to buy other things. And that's just one example of how our indulging in our desires would stop us from this idea of respect that we should constantly maintain. Third, aspirations should not be felt fulfilled. Now, aspirations are very important. They're goals that we set in our lives and keeps us motivated so that we're always striving to be better. It could be, something short-term, like passing an exam, completing our university degree. But at the same time, we should also have lifelong aspirations. For example, if we're learning about Sinology, this traditional Chinese wisdom, we should have a very broad aim and a mission to help really impart these teachings and this wisdom for future generations to ensure that these teachings continue to be perpetuated, that they never stop, so that more and more generations can benefit. Now that involves lifelong learning and lifelong practice. So there's never a time when we feel that it's enough. We can always do more. Now that's just in relation to sort of general sort of life aspirations, but you can sort of think about it on a micro level in terms of the tasks that we have to do. So when someone gives us a task, then oftentimes, if it's easy, we think, well, what I'm doing is enough. It's good enough, or it's good enough for now, and maybe I can do some more later. And we end up procrastinating, we become complacent, and then ultimately it becomes a rush job, or it becomes less than satisfactory. So aspirations that we feel are fulfilled, that we think we've done enough, leads to complacency and therefore less respect in the job that we need to complete and less respect towards the person who's given us that job. So that's why we should also be mindful of that. And finally, pleasure. I think that this is very easy to understand. If we are actually indulging and enjoying ourselves in this particular moment, what often happens is that we just want it to continue. We want this good feeling to continue forever, to the detriment of even our own personal and mental health, and to the detriment of the people around us and their needs. So what often happens is that, we only think of ourselves during these times, and we forget to think about the needs and the feelings of others. So actually all four of these tendencies are problematic because they topple our right sense of mind, this sense of respect and concern for others. So if we think about it, the records of ritual tells us that we need to maintain this mindset of respectfulness, which helps us think about how to constantly maintain the mean. It should show through in our words and actions. When our emotions hijack our thoughts, words and actions, we need to immediately detect them and curb them. Now you might say that actually even these emotions are very difficult to detect because it's sort of drawn out from us when we interact with certain people or when we encounter certain situations. We immediately feel certain things, and therefore these words and actions just come out. And that's where the records of ritual turns to next. So it talks about how we should interact with others in a way that maintains this equilibrium. So first, when we're familiar with the virtuous, we should always keep respecting them. If we are in awe of them, we should still be fond of their virtues. So let's think about this idea of familiarity. So let's not talk about the idea of, whether it's someone who is virtuous first. Let's just talk about if we become familiar with someone. Okay, what does that mean? So it might mean that we have close contact with them, we see them every day, or we have frequent communication with them to the point where we feel that we understand them and they understand us. And an example of this feeling of familiarity is that when we talk with them, we might dispense with the pleasantries, and get straight to the point of what we need to talk about. What I mean by pleasantries is when we, when we begin a conversation, say, oh, how are you going? We talk about the weather, etc. And this is important and necessary when you first get to know someone, because you want to show that you care. You want to show that you're concerned about how they are physically, in their environment. So this is why the pleasantries are important, to show that we care. Now, if we're familiar with someone, we might do away with the pleasantries, but that comes at a risk, right? There's a risk that we forget to consider their feelings and think only of ourselves, because not only do we do away with the pleasantries, we also do away with the pleases and thank yous, right? So we might forget to be grateful and appreciate them. So as a very simple example, we might have a very good housemate who's always, helping us with the dishes. And for the first few times that they help us out, we're very grateful and we say thank you and, think about whether we should help them. After a while, maybe a couple of days, a few weeks, we just let them do it and we don't need to thank them anymore. After a while, we expect them to do it. And if they don't do it, we demand it of them, without even thinking that actually it's really our job too. So you can see how this idea of familiarity can set in very quickly. And it's actually one of the key reasons why friendships, relationships, and even marriages break down over time, is because we forget to appreciate and be grateful to the other person. We take them for granted and we demand things from them. We expect things from them. And so that's why it's telling us we have to be careful when we start feeling familiar with the other person. Now, that doesn't mean that we should treat close friends and family like strangers. No, this is definitely not the case at all. But it's telling us that whether we're familiar with them or whether we've just met them, we should still maintain that concern and care for them. And in particular, be very considerate of their contributions and respectful of what they've done for this relationship. Because in any relationship, when we look at the 5 fundamental relationships, it's made up of two people doing their part and being responsible for different things. And that's what makes the relationship. So in any relationship, we have to be aware of what the other person is doing and their contributions, and always be appreciative. So that's this constancy, constant appreciation and respect of the other person and their contributions. So then, here, of course, it talks about familiar with the virtuous, and not just anyone. Well, the virtuous refers to people who we might hold in high esteem because we feel that we can learn from them in some way. In terms of virtue, it's really their character. What happens when we have close contact with them over time is that we start to think that we see their faults. No one's 100% perfect, and we start to judge them. And the moment we start judging them, we think that, they're just normal like us, and we stop respecting them. So that's why it says, familiar with the virtuous, yet respect them. Now, I say that we think we perceive their faults because it really is in the eye of the beholder. When we first meet them, why is it that we only see their strengths? And then later down the track, we only see their faults. It's actually all because of us and our own minds and us focusing on the different aspects of this person, because everyone has their strengths. Now, what would an exemplary person do? They know that the way is found everywhere, that everyone has an enlightened virtue, and it's a matter of really learning from the strengths of everyone, seeing into their virtues. Because the moment that we lose respect for them, who loses out the most? It's actually us. Because we stop focusing on their strengths, we stop learning from them, and we ourselves stop improving. And that's why it's so important, these particular instructions here, that we are familiar with the virtuous, yet we respect them. And it says here, in awe of them, yet being fond of their virtue. So again, it's talking about the virtuous. Another sort of feeling that we have when we meet someone who we think is very good in terms of virtue or in terms of some skill or talent, is that we revere them, but at the same time, we're a bit scared and in wonder of them, as if they're not human, that they're, very special. Now, where does this fear come about? Well, it's when we start thinking about how we present ourselves. And maybe we're scared that they'll see through us, that they're scared that they'll see our faults and judge us because they're so good. So this awe can often be an obstacle to us learning from their virtues, from their strengths. And so that's why it says here that, yes, we need to revere them, but at the same time, we shouldn't let that cloud our ability to learn from them. We shouldn't think about ourselves and how we look. We should think about how we can learn. And that's what the exemplary person would do. The next line is even more, something that is even more relatable. It talks about how we should love, yet know the other person's faults. We might despise them, and yet know of their strengths. So this teaches us to be level-headed, whoever we interact with. So yes, we have loved ones, our family, our siblings, our parents, but that doesn't mean that we spoil them and only see their good points. We should be able to also point out their weaknesses and help guide them so that they can improve. By helping them with their faults, we're helping them improve. That's quite easy to understand. But the second part might be more difficult to understand. Why is it that we have to know the strengths of those we despise? Why might that be important? Well, this particular person, we might not get along with them. We might disagree with them in various aspects, various issues. But that doesn't mean that they don't have their strengths or talents or contributions that they can make to the community, to the family, etc. So, yes, we might not get along with them, but then we shouldn't be partial to understanding their faults and being able to promote and praise their strengths. Because if we promote and praise their strengths, then they're encouraged to continue down that track, and perhaps that will also help them improve their faults. So you can see the common denominator here, isn't it? Regardless of whether you like or dislike a person, you're always focusing on helping them, on benefiting them. So your mindset is unchanged in this constancy when you're interacting with someone. So you're not moved. You don't have these emotions. You're not focusing on your own emotions of, oh, I really love this person, or I really hate this person. You're focusing on the way, which is the ability to always benefit the other person, as you would like someone to benefit you too. So this is in relation to our interactions, and it's really just a snapshot of some of the ways we might be biased. We might lose this equilibrium and lose our respect. The next part deals with situations. It says here, accumulate, yet able to disperse. Rest in comfort, yet able to move. Accumulation refers to wealth and property. And yes, everyone likes to gain rather than give. So here it's telling us that we shouldn't hold on to this wealth, but be able to part with it in times of need. If we see our family or community members who really need help, then we're able to benefit them. So this is this idea of maintaining equilibrium and an equanimity regardless of the situation. And the second is we might be in comfortable surroundings. We're very satisfied with our work life, our home life, etc. But we still have to be cautious and be able to point out and note any dangers and relocate at the slightest hint of any danger to ourselves or our family. So I like this photo because it's sort of a house on top of a cliff. And, imagine if you're having a party inside that house. You'd think that, you're really safe. But as soon as you look out the window, if you step out, you'll realize that you're actually in a very dangerous position. And, if parts of that rock gives way, is eroded, then you need to be able to relocate. So there's this line in one of the Confucian classics that says, dwell in peace, but be mindful of the perils. And it's actually a Chinese idiom. And it's this idea that, regardless of whether we're comfortable or not, we still need to be cautious. We need to be prepared to move if it benefits not only ourselves, but also others. Sort of like if you were a doctor and you had to relocate to a remote location because there weren't enough medical staff there. So medical help is needed there and you're ready to locate. It's about your work. It's about providing for the community more than your own comfort. Next parts relate to other situations. So encountering wealth, do not improperly attain it. So it seems within our reach, but how do we attain this wealth? That's very important. Improper attainment of the wealth can be thought of in two ways. First, ill-gotten gains refers to attaining wealth illegally. For example, bribery, fraud, or exploitation, etc. And what happens is that this wealth that we gain will ultimately be lost through our own personal misfortune. So it could be that we ourselves suffer some sort of misfortune in terms of our health, and then all this wealth is used up in medical bills. It could be some natural man-made disaster that forces us to have extensive losses to our property, etc. The other type of gain that is improper is undeserved gains. It's when we attain the wealth or acquire wealth not through our own personal efforts. And this kind of wealth cannot be enjoyed for long. So you can see how if we improperly attain this wealth, then it doesn't last long and also there are consequences. The next part talks about meeting calamity, but not improperly escaping it. This calamity is not just related to sort of disasters, but actual moral issues, related to our own self-cultivation or that of our family. So if we're in some moral dilemma, we should try to meet our responsibilities, do what is right, rather than evade it. So if we evade our responsibilities, that would be called improperly escaping it. So this is why Confucius said in the Analects that to see what is right and not to do it is to lack courage. So in these situations, when we meet with some sort of difficulties in our life, we need to do what is right. We need to have that courage. So you can see, of course, that all of this opening passage in the Records of Ritual relates to how exactly we can constantly maintain the mean in our mindset, through our words and actions, through curbing these emotions, in the way we interact with others, whether we're familiar with them or not, whether we are in awe of them or not, doesn't stop us from learning, being respectful. Whether we like them or dislike them doesn't stop us from helping them. And in any situation we find ourselves in, whether it's a situation of difficulty or ease, whether we are in health or in sickness, we still have to step up to the plate and try to maintain the mean, which is to cultivate the way regardless. And so the exemplary person would always stay focused and remain unmoved, regardless of who they meet and what situation they find themselves in. And interestingly enough, we can relate this back to what we studied in the highest learning. So in the highest learning, it tells us to not be partial when we're interacting with others. So we shouldn't simply be close to those who we favor and resent anyone we look down on. We shouldn't revere those whom we fear, pity those whom we sympathize with, or become arrogant to those who we disdain. So in all these situations, we're becoming partial and we're not interacting with them with due respect and by ultimately being able to learn from them. And therefore, it says that it's very rare to find someone in the world who can love, but know the faults of those they love, hate, but know the strengths of those they hate, which really echoes the comments in the Records of Ritual. The highest learning also teaches us how to rectify our minds and not be a slave to these emotions of anger, fear, delight, and anxious. And again, it relates back to that idea of indulging in our desires or, indulging in these pleasures to excess. Interestingly enough, we can find the same theme in the Dizugui. So how do we interact with others with this sort of impartiality, regardless of the situation? Well, if our parents love us, or if they don't love us, maybe they might favor one of our siblings, we should still respect and love them. Then in another line, it tells us that whether the person is rich or poor, whether they're an old friend or a new friend, we still have to treat them in the same way with that care and concern. In terms of situations, we might be able to eat our favorite food tonight. Well, we still have to eat to the right amount and not overeat. We hold containers empty as if they were full. Enter rooms as if they were occupied. So we still have to knock, even though it's an empty room, just in case. So our mindset remains the same, and we're not careless. And finally, this idea of, even if a task is difficult, or even if it's easy, we still have to be meticulous. We still have to cross the T's and dot the I's so that we're giving due respect to the task, we're not neglecting it, and due respect to the person who has given us this task and who we are ultimately contributing this work to. This is this idea of respect regardless. And so we can see how Confucius didn't just talk about this. In the Mencius talks about how Confucius actually practiced it himself. He says that Confucius was the sort of person who would hasten his departure or delay it. He would remain in a state or take office. And it was all according to the circumstances. And that's why Confucius was a sage whose actions were timely. So we can learn from Confucius himself in his actions that he wasn't particularly attached to his comfort. He didn't think of his own comfort, staying in his home state, or being biased to a particular leader. What he did, and when he did it, was completely in accordance with the right timing. So it was right for those particular circumstances at that time and at that place. So the exemplary person then constantly cultivates the way. And they are able to do so and think of the bigger picture. They're constantly maintaining the mean, as it says here. The petty person is not able to do so. For example, they will do anything just to achieve wealth and prestige. And little do they know that if they try to attain it through illegal means or through exploitation, that these ill-gotten gains are only going to be temporary and they will suffer the consequences. So you can see that what the petty person achieves is temporary, The exemplary person, however, is constantly focused on the way because that is the only constant. Whatever is gained, this harmony, this peace, inner peace, harmony on the outside with people that we relate to, that is long lasting. And any wealth or any possessions that we gain through the cultivation of the way, that will also be long lasting as well. So then this very nicely leads to the next quote, in which Confucius says that the practice of the mean is perfection indeed, but people are seldom able to do so for long. If you remember, there was also the same, almost the same line in the Analects. And I've bolded here in the Chinese the additional words that are used. But because of the additional words, what it ultimately says in the Analects is that the practice of the mean is the uttermost virtue. So this utmost virtue, you can see why it is so amazing and so perfect, is because if we can do that, then we are completely at ease, regardless of our situation and regardless of who we interact with on a day-to-day basis. We achieve peace of mind. We are unmoved by the situations. But also we can already see that it can be quite challenging. It's not as easy as we think, because we have to keep check on what's happening inside of ourselves, the emotions, the feelings, and our partiality towards certain things and people. But Confucius is the consummate teacher, because he doesn't tell us that it's impossible. He tells us that people can do it, but it's just really rare. And in that way, he's actually challenging us to step up to the plate, to be that exceptional person who is able to achieve the practice of the mean constantly. And we can all do it because it's actually part of our innate nature. This virtue of constant respect for others or care for others, this humanity, it's within us. We have flashes or moments where we're able to really empathize with others, but it's a matter of holding on to that and continuing that over the long term. So this is what Confucius is encouraging us to do. He says, be that person, be the exception. Now the next part tells us what are the other pitfalls we need to look out for. The master said, I know why the way is not practiced. The wise go beyond it. The foolish do not reach it. I know why it is that the way is not clear. The worthy go beyond it. The unworthy do not reach it. Now, all people drink and eat, but few are able to know the flavors. So what's really interesting about this passage is that Confucius analyzes the practice of the way, we could call it the practice of the mean, in terms of two aspects, our knowledge and our practice. So it's important that we learn, because without learning, we won't even know what the way is, what the mean is. But if we don't practice, this learning is never really realized. It's never really fulfilled. And so there's two parts, isn't there? Knowledge and practice. When we talk about knowledge, we think about people who know a lot and those who don't. So that's why it talks about the idea of the wise and the foolish. Now, just a quick note, the wise and the worthy here are actually derogatory terms because they refer to people who think that they're wise and think that they're worthy when they're really not. So it's not equivalent to the exemplary person. The exemplary person is always able to cultivate the way. The wise and the worthy here are not. So this is what we'll talk about. It says that the wise and the foolish, in terms of their understanding and learning, they have misunderstandings. Their learning is incomplete. And as a result, they have difficulties in practicing because you have to know what to do before you can do it. So that's why it says in the quote, the way is not practiced because the wise go beyond it. The foolish do not reach it. So a very simple example used in the commentaries is this idea of the ritual etiquette of mourning for our parents for 3 years. So the 3-year mourning period. Now this was upheld in the dynasties prior to the times of Confucius. So the Xia dynasty, the Shang dynasty. Now, Confucius lived during the Zhou dynasty. And at this point in time, people were already starting to reduce the number of years of mourning because they thought it was too cumbersome, too burdensome. And there's this conversation between Confucius and his student Zai Wo. And Zai Wo is quite brazen. He asks Confucius, can we reduce the mourning period? And Confucius tells him very bluntly, no. Because why is that? Is because the 3-year mourning period is designed so that we can be mindful of the sacrifices our parents made in the first 3 years of our life. The first 3 years of our life, I don't know if anyone still remembers, but this was before we could speak or talk, walk or talk, and we couldn't even feed ourselves. So even if we were hungry, we were completely dependent on the care of our parents, which was around the clock. It's 24/7 that they cared for us. Because of that, this 3-year mourning period is designed so that we remember that. And by remembering that, for the rest of our lives, we live in honor of them. We do things that will make them proud and contribute to the community in their name. So that's the whole point of the 3-year mourning period. Now, back to this particular passage. Well, there's 3 years. It's a standard. But the wise, they might think, well, isn't that such good reasons for us to have this mourning period? Let's extend it. So they think that they're very intelligent and they extend the mourning period. Those who are foolish don't even know why there's a mourning period and why we need to have a mourning period, so they won't even bother achieving or reaching 3 years. And that's why it says that the wise go beyond it and the foolish do not reach it. Now, in terms of practice, you have the worthy and the unworthy. So the worthy are people who think that they're really practicing very well, when in fact both types of people are not practicing to the standard. And then this leads to misunderstandings. It leads to them not being able to explain it. So it says here, the worthy go beyond and the unworthy do not reach it. So if they're trying to explain the way, the worthy, they might sort of focus on the more abstract and theoretical aspects, maybe the metaphysical aspects of the way. And, people, when they hear it, they don't understand how to actually do it. They don't understand it, so they can't do it. The unworthy, because they haven't practiced, they don't even know about it, obviously they can't really talk about it. And that's why the way is not clear. It's not clearly explained. It's only someone who has really learned, has that scholarship, and has also put it into practice that can really explain it in a way that's accessible and understandable for the general audience. Now, we don't need to look at anyone. Let's just think about Confucius, who's the exemplary teacher. We know that he had broad scholarship, but also he made it part of his life. He was living it. How did he explain the way? How did he explain this practice of the mean? Well, in the Analects, we read how, in fact, he never really talks about the way. He never really talks about the heavenly ways, this ultimate reality, nor does he talk about the innate nature very much. He talks about moral qualities, virtue, humanity, yes, but even that can be quite abstract. And as we talked about when we had the introduction to the Analects, we explained how even humanity, there's never really a stock standard definition that Confucius gives us. So it still is quite vague. Now, what he does talk about a lot is that of ritual propriety or ritual etiquette. And why? Is because it's something that's specific. It's something that people can understand and they can immediately practice in their daily lives. So let's look at one example, again, from the Records of Ritual. This is in relation to the why Confucius and how Confucius talks about this idea of ritual. He says that if the exemplary person acquires broad learning, but focuses it through ritual, so they learn, but they practice it with ritual, then they're hardly likely to go astray. So they're going to be on the path. They're going to be able to cultivate. It's just a matter of time. And then in the Records of Ritual, it talks about how the way, our moral qualities, humanity, rightness cannot be realized without ritual propriety. because you can see that, if we don't even understand it, we can't practice it. And if we're not practicing, then our understanding is also limited. So at the very fundamental level, you could say the beginner's steps, but ultimately the path to the utmost achievement and excellence is ritual etiquette or ritual propriety. Now, just a very quick example of this one instruction of ritual propriety. It comes from the Records of Ritual and talks about when we are certain, do not let what you say appear as your own view. Now, this is not to be evasive. You actually know that this is correct and you're very honest and sincere when you share it with others. But actually, what this teaches us is that we have to give credit to others. Everything that we know, from the moment that we're born, we were taught by our parents, we saw how they lived, and then when we went to school, we were taught by our teachers, we were in the community, we might read the news or some sort of text. Actually, all this knowledge comes from the external. So we have to give credit where it's due to those who've come before us, who've actually done the work and the research. But also by acknowledging the sources of our knowledge, we help others, we benefit others, because if they want to learn more, if they want to, try to understand more about what we've said, then they can also go away and research it if we give them those clues, you could say, our sources. So it's important that we acknowledge our sources, and it's important that we give credit to others. This is what you might even call academic integrity if we're writing essays, etc. But at the end of the day, you can see that this is something very simple. You read it, you immediately understand it. And it's something that you can immediately put into practice in your daily life. That when you say something, try to quote someone and possibly give credit to the person that you heard it from. When you do that, when you can do that, this is practicing our consideration for others by helping them understand about where our information came from and if they want to learn more. This is humanity. We're also cultivating our humility. This humility is because we realize that it's not really our own personal opinions. It's actually something that we've received from someone else. So this is cultivating our virtue. And ultimately, it leads us straight back to the way and the fact that we're all interconnected. Everything that we know, the fruits of the research of others, is and what we enjoy on a day-to-day basis through technology, etc. It all comes about from the interdependence that we have with others in the community, that we are so dependent on what others do and their contributions, and we also have to contribute in our own ways. So we are connected to this greater picture, and that means we value everyone for what they do, rather than thinking that it's all us. It's just our own values, our own opinions, and everyone else doesn't matter. So you can see that through ritual propriety, we are connected to humanity, virtue, and ultimately the way. And then ultimately, Confucius concludes this passage with an analogy. He says that all people drink and eat, but few are able to know the flavors. Now, you might be wondering, how is that possible? Because I know exactly if my food is not salty enough or spicy. Here, in the commentaries, it's very interesting because they provide us with some historical figures who have amazing senses of taste, and it sort of puts our sense of taste into perspective. So in the commentaries, it talks about how Lord Huan of the state of Qi, who lived before the times of Confucius, he had a very special and talented chef. His name was Iya, and this particular chef, when he ate something, he knew immediately the source of the food. So, for example, if he ate something sweet, we know that, sugar creates sweetness. But he could tell whether it was cane sugar, molasses, fructose, or whatever, something else. If he drank some water, he knew whether it was from a well, from a pond, from a mountain spring, or from a river. So he had amazing an amazing sense of taste. There's also someone from the 4th century in China, Fu Lang, who was able to, when he ate, I think it was a goose, he could tell immediately, he knew whether this goose, the types of feathers the goose had, and if he had ate a chicken, he would be able to understand how this chicken lived, or this. So it sort of calls into question our ability to taste, but I don't know if I would want those superpowers. Essentially, what Confucius is saying here is not the literal meaning of drinking and eating and knowing the flavors like these amazing people in the past, but he's trying to say that every one of us lives our lives, right? We all interact with others. We need to handle situations in our daily life. But do we know where it comes from? Do we realize and see the innate nature in these things in our daily moments? And that's the flavor. So if we go back to what we were talking about before, do we know the flavors when we interact with others? So when we're familiar with them, do we still remain respectful? So cultivating the way, or practicing the mean, is when we see the way, it's not to see nothing. It's actually being able to see what needs to be seen and how to react in the right way, how to remain respectful, how to remain with care and consideration for others. So do we know the flavors of our interactions with others? How are we able to achieve harmony? Are we able to achieve respect in all our interactions? That's to know the flavors. That's to really handle the situation in the right way. And then the last quote that I'll talk about today is very short. Confucius says, "Alas, the way is not practiced." Now, this is a lament because we know that Confucius traveled to the various states and he was trying to implement his political vision, which was grounded in humanity, this idea of particularly the state leader trying to care for the people through their virtue. And he's disappointed in a way that, none of the state leaders really want to implement this idea of humanity and the way. So the way is not practiced. No one wants to cultivate it. So if these state leaders are not cultivating the way, then they're not able to educate the people. And as a result, the way is not understood and therefore it's not practiced. So this particular quote is provided not to tell us that, it's completely hopeless, but actually to give us hope, to say, again, it's used to challenge us, to say, will we step up to the plate? Will we be this person who practices the way or practices the mean constantly? Can we do it? And Confucius has told us in the other texts, but also what we'll read later in this text, that it can be done. And it's actually something that can be done in our everyday moments. It's not something that is far from us or unattainable. So in this section, after the opening passage, we're told some of the pitfalls of the practice of the mean, that we have to constantly maintain it. It's not just a matter of momentarily maintaining it. And also not to be too wise or too clever and think that we know it all, but rather be very careful and cautious and make sure that we are able to understand what the measures, what the standards are. And one of the fastest ways of understanding the mean is through ritual etiquette. So next week, what we'll discuss are several exemplars of the practice of the mean, particularly King Shun. How did he achieve the greatest wisdom? So we'll look at that next week and continue this conversation about how we can practice the mean and how we can ultimately lead exemplary lives unmoved by our circumstances or who we interact with, and constantly be able to maintain a sense of harmony and a sense of respect of others. So I'll end there today. Thank you very much for listening and look forward to seeing you next week.